So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity today to introduce our latest contribution to the GEF Global Program to support countries with the shift to electric mobility, an interactive comparative tool to compare the total cost of ownership across different kinds of light-duty vehicles. The Global Environment Facility, GEF, approved a program of work in 2019 that aims to accelerate the shift to electric mobility across 50 countries in Africa, Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, Central and Eastern Europe, West Asia and the Middle East. The slide shows the organizations leading the efforts in each of the 4 regional support platforms and across 4 global thematic working groups shown on the right-hand side of the slide. The IEA's contributions are at the global level across these thematic working groups, and we aim to establish a network for global advocacy, technology and policy advice, and to deliver knowledge, materials, and tools. This includes data and policy updates that we focus on in our flagship annual publication on electric mobility, the Global EV Outlook, where we will continue to expand the scope to include updates on the countries where GEF has country projects and tools like the TCO tool that we'll launch today. So again, the goal of the GEF 7 program is to promote electromobility in the participating countries, raise awareness, and facilitate the transition to electric mobility. The list of the 50 countries with GEF 7 projects is shown here. The 4 regional platform leads are already starting to engage in various in-country activities, including delivering capacity building and training events, establishing communities of practice, all with the aim of facilitating replication and upscaling of electric mobility related projects at the city, regional, and national level. The TCO tool is the first of 2 online tools that the IEA will develop to contribute to the Global Thematic Working Group, one focusing on light-duty vehicles. The tool was designed to provide clear, transparent, and accessible information on the costs of owning and operating, for instance, hybrid or pure battery electric cars versus conventional internal combustion engine cars running on gasoline. The next tool, which we will develop in the coming year or 2, will aim to add to this a comparison of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from making, owning and operating, and then the scrappage or potential recycling of the car and its components. The IEA is the coordinator of the Clean Energy Ministerial's Electric Vehicle Initiative, which currently has the 16 member countries whose flags are shown here. As the coordinator, our major contribution is the annual publication of the Global EV Outlook, a report that synthesizes the latest official data from member countries and other sources on the EV market, on charging infrastructure, and with an analysis of the implications of the latest road transport and EV-related policies to focus on the prospects for continuing electrification to 2030 under the IEA's long-term scenario projections. But as I mentioned, going forward, we want to focus more on providing updates on the progress in electric mobility in the 50 countries participating in the GEF 7 e-mobility program. So if you are joining us today as an expert from one of these countries, or you know someone who we should reach out to for data on electric vehicles, including all the vehicle categories, 2- and 3-wheelers, cars and buses, trucks, or on publicly available chargers, or on policies relevant to road transport and electric mobility, please reach out to Shane McDonough, who will present the tool in a second here, and whose email is shown on this slide. And we'll add your name to the list of a group of stakeholders we're inviting to 2 webinars in January of next year to discuss how we can work together to collect these important data and information on policies and to ensure that they're considered in the upcoming edition of the Global EV Outlook. And with that plug for your help, I'll now hand the floor to Shane McDonough, who together with Barbara Moore of the IEA's Communication and Digital Office has put together a really excellent tool that policymakers and the wider public alike can use to explore the costs of owning and operating various types of cars and vans.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Shane McDonough, and I'm just going to present the launch of the TCO tool. So the majority of today's presentation is essentially a demonstration and a run through of the tool. And we have a little bit of context on maybe the purpose of the tool and also some summary on kind of the key lessons that I hoped they would impart on users. So firstly, and I'd like to reiterate what Jacob just said, a huge thank you to my colleagues, one of whom is in the room, Bruno, who helped me with this, and Aditi Aramji, but a special thank you to Barbara Moore in our CDO division here, who did a huge amount of work in developing this tool and making it suitable for use online. Firstly, a small bit of context, as I said, the GEF program aims to promote electromobility in a very diverse group of countries. There's differences in terms of the tax regimes, in terms of the cost of the vehicle, in terms of the availability of different technologies. And to try and develop a tool that is suitable for all of these countries came with its own difficulties. Promoting electromobility in these countries is essential, not just for reducing emissions, but also for increasing air quality and for a number of other kind of climate ambitions. There's a wide range of projects. So this tool specifically looks at light duty vehicles, but at some point in the future, we hope to possibly extend that to other sectors such as buses or to heavy duty vehicles or even to 2- and 3-wheelers. Like I said, specifically, we're looking at light duty vehicles, and that's because we're part of Working Group 1. Another working group here in the IEA is Working Group 4, who are focusing on grid integration. So again, very much focused on electromobility and how that has an effect on the grid and what kind of policies and what ways can we best integrate it, particularly with a focus on developing and emerging economies. Small bit more context, because I think it's important. This tool is specifically looking to promote electromobility in these emerging economies. And to do so, it needs to be applicable to a very wide range of users. So these users have very different backgrounds in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their technical ability to understand different elements of the tool, whether they're making a purchasing decision themselves or whether they're a policymaker looking to encourage adoption of electric vehicles. We wanted to give some learning opportunities that would be relevant to all regions. So as we saw from the first slide, the GEF countries are very, very diverse. And so drilling down into one specific region and producing a tool that wasn't applicable to all wasn't really an option, and it certainly wouldn't be ideal. We wanted to understand the effect that different policies would have. So when we look at policies, for example, grants and subsidies, these are quite easily understood by different stakeholders, but other policies such as improving the financing conditions might be a little bit more difficult. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that there was awareness that the technology is improving. So if we produce a TCO tool that exclusively looked at prices today, that might skew the opinion of many users, particularly those without that technical background, which is far from ideal. So we wanted to show that even if electromobility is not competitive today, the costs are generally heading in one direction, and there will be a point at there will be a time at some point in the future where it is much more competitive. I'm going to switch now, and live demonstrations are always fun to try and immediately an issue. There we go. Oh. Okay, so we can getting there. This is the tool. It was launched about 20 minutes ago. Thanks very much, Barbara. And this is as it will appear on the website. So we've tried to produce it in such a way that it is very accessible to the wide range of users, like we said. And I'm going to go kind of through the tool step by step here. So as you land on the page, what we have is some background information. We can't take for granted that people know exactly what a total cost of ownership comparison is. And so we really have to start from the beginning. We have some information here on the different variables that are important. And we also have some key lessons. Ideally, all the users will click here on the lessons. And what I'll do is I'll briefly show you what I mean. So some of the key concepts here are the concept of, for example, cumulative costs. And we want to show that even though vehicles can have different upfront costs, the operating costs, for example, fuel and maintenance, will vary, and that can have an effect on how much money you have spent by the time you either sell or scrap the vehicle. So we're trying to teach the concept here of cumulative costs and variation in upfront costs and operating costs. What we're talking about then is cost parity. So the idea that when these lines intersect, it means that you've reached a point where one vehicle has the equal cumulative costs of another. We're talking about financing conditions, and we're saying that basically you can have the same price of a car, but depending on the interest rate applied or the number of years over which you pay the loan, it can have a drastic effect on the total cost of ownership. And again, maybe these lessons seem quite basic, but we're trying to make sure that this tool is applicable to as wide a range of users as possible. One thing that we found is that these lessons are very much applicable to both ordinary users and to policymakers. We're talking about total cost of ownership. We're talking about the aggregated effect of these different issues. And essentially what we're trying to do is make sure that by the time the user comes further down the page, they understand the results. So we have here a cumulative effect, and these lessons are available for the user whenever they want to use them. What we have is both a basic and an advanced version, and I'll take you through the basic version first. These are pitched again such that anyone can use the tool, and it means that the number of variables available to them is reduced at the start. What we didn't want to do was essentially crowd the page or make the tool unavailable to people because there were too many things to play with at the start. We have our estimated total cost of ownership, which is our essentially simplified results in terms of dollars per kilometer, dollars per year. And we also have our cumulative cost curve. So the users will have gone through the lessons ideally, and they'll understand how to interpret the graph here. We have a second graph, which is a breakdown of the total cost of ownership. And by hovering over these segments, you can see the contribution of different costs to the total. The idea here, exactly as we said before, we can compare varying upfront and operating costs, but on an equal basis. We have a number of regions. So some of our example regions are India, Indonesia, South Africa, Argentina, and Ukraine. And what we have then is a custom option. And users can use this custom option when they don't see their own country appear in the list. It's not possible to model every country. Number one, the data is very difficult to obtain. And number two, again, it would kind of be counter to the idea that we're trying to minimize the user interface and make it easy to use. So we have options for examining the cost both today and around 10 years from now. The reason we are maybe somewhat vague about this is we're trying to make sure that this is seen as not just a projection of costs, but a bit of an estimate. Some of the variables that can be changed are annual driving distance, the vehicle type. So we have small, medium, large, we have pickup trucks and SUVs. And we also have different powertrains. The powertrains we look at are petrol, diesel, petrol hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and battery electric. And we also obviously have fuel costs. Again, it's important to note here that these are not projections based on IEA data. The fuel costs are actually constant across time. Within the basic version, what we can do is we can look at, for example, a plug-in hybrid. And this is where the lessons start to become apparent. So what we want to do is make sure that if someone chooses a plug-in hybrid, for example, by giving them the option to say whether some or most of their daily journeys are covered by battery, we're trying to make sure that they understand that how much you use your battery has a big effect on the total breakdown of your cost. So if we look here and we click between some of our journeys and most of our journeys, we can see the dramatic change it has. And this, again, important to impart that lesson to the user. What we would like to avoid, for example, with plug-in hybrids is the insinuation that your behavior is not important to the total cost of ownership. So we understand here, and there's debate among the technical community, you know, what should be the accepted emissions factor of a plug-in hybrid. And we're trying to show the user that it's really important to account for your behavior. We have the option for a home charger, which is important in some regions, maybe less so in others. And we can compare, for example, to a battery electric, where we also have the option to install a home charger, and we can vary our fuel costs. One thing that's important with this is the option to change fuels and change costs and see the effect of those live. What this does is acts as a form of sensitivity analysis. And again, it helps the users to understand what effect the changes they're having have on the total costs. It would be, again, suboptimal, to say the least, if it were a case that the users had to input all of these assumptions and then the results popped up at the end. So by changing one assumption and seeing the effect that it has, users are able to interact with the tool in a much more meaningful way. What I'm going to do now is just briefly switch to the advanced version, where you see that there are many, many more options. So what we have is the vehicle cost before taxes. We have the various taxes that are applied, and we have residual value. So how we account for the fact that these vehicles have different lifetimes is we assume a constant life rate of 10 years. And by adjusting the residual value, we can then essentially account for the fact that, for example, a diesel engine would likely have a longer lifetime than a battery electric, and we can compare them evenly. It might make more sense, or some of our more technical audience might wonder why we don't have differing lifetimes. But again, we're pitching this for users that are making often real world decisions, and we're trying to make it as easy to understand as possible while maintaining that good level of accuracy. We have other costs here like registration fees, insurance, maintenance, and our fuel efficiency is obviously quite important. And another element here is differentiated day and night charging. So we might understand that the effect that this has on the overall cost is quite low, but we're trying to impart the lesson, particularly to policymakers, that if we can allow for differentiated charging rates, we can include that in our policy options, and it would gel very well with the working group 4 idea of trying to promote grid integration and grid stability. The share of charging is very important, and again, users can play around with this and see their effect live. The financing conditions is something that we found to be particularly important to talk about because of the great effect that it has on TCO and the financing conditions that are available in many of these developing and emerging economies. So they tend to have very high interest rates and very short loan lengths, which is very much not in favor of electrified transport. So by changing these again, we can see the effect these have. One thing that's important to note, or one of many things, is if we go up, we can see that not all vehicles are available in all markets. We didn't want to allow for wholly unrealistic comparisons, particularly in today. So for example, if you look here, we don't have the option to have a plug-in hybrid pickup truck because such a vehicle does not exist today. With that, I'm going to switch back to my slides. Okay, so the learning opportunities for the users. We want them to understand the key concepts, like the various powertrains that are available, what we mean by cumulative costs. We need them to understand that upfront and operating costs can be different and the effect that these have on the TCO. By changing annual distance, you change the attractiveness of different powertrains and you change the marginal cost. The simple example being the more you drive, the more attractive a battery electric vehicle is. We want them to understand policy relevant lessons. So the financing conditions, for example, if a policymaker was to use this tool, we would hope that it would be apparent that by offering favorable financing conditions, they can increase the attractiveness of electromobility, and that would be a relatively cost neutral measure for government to try and implement. We also want them to look at the potential effect of subsidies. So for example, if you're offering a grant on electromobility, what does this do to TCO relative to a different policy? In all, we want users of this tool to be able to play around and understand what changes can increase EV competitiveness. I hope that was apparent from using the tool, and I'll share a link when we're finished and everyone can have a use of it themselves. Some insights from the development that were important. We undertook quite a significant amount of stakeholder engagement. We did some internal and external webinars, and we did lots of sessions for feedback, and this tool was very much produced iteratively. One thing that was key was that citizens and policymakers benefit from the same tools. Sometimes we assume that policymakers need very specific tools and messages, when in fact, how we present our messages to citizens and policymakers can often have the same benefit for both. Be aware of assumed knowledge. So we use a lot of jargon here as engineers, and very often our point gets lost when we do so. So when we're trying to talk to ordinary users, particularly in developing and emerging economies, we have to be careful about what words we use and what language we use. When you're building a tool, try and aim to have a process that's as iterative as possible. You're never going to get it right the first time. And something that we found that was very useful was to try and empathize with users. So try and put yourself in their shoes and wonder how they would interact with the tool. We use sensitivity analysis to reduce the complexity. So as you saw from the tool, only the most important, we'll call it, variables were used. We had a figure of about 1.5%. So we did not include anything that didn't have a significant impact. And that would include things like the degradation in the fuel economy over time. Although that's quite important for our own modeling and for our own, for example, LCA, it's more information than is needed when we're facing users or when we have an audience, such as with the Jeff region. Try and avoid false precision. It's almost a continuation of the last point. And error on the side of simplicity where possible. It's more important to impart those lessons than it is to try and have the most accurate TCO possible. When we're doing things like trying to find the cost of a car, we have to appreciate that there's huge variation in things like trim level. And so having too much precision in terms of the cost of the car, that gets buried, and the user then perhaps loses sight of the greater lessons. So a quick summary then. The tool, we aims to have some policy and cost relevant lessons throughout. Only the most important variables were used. This encourages, it means we can highlight those lessons and stuff doesn't get lost. It caters for both high level and more detailed comparisons. We have that basic and that advanced user face. And the real time results mean that users can perform sensitivity analysis and develop some lessons of their own. Lastly then, I'm just going to leave another email address up here. So if anyone has any feedback or any suggestions or areas we can get more data, please feel free to contact us. This tool is very much live and we can add countries and change information over time. So as we get access to more we say accurate sources of information, we can make changes to the tool. So please send on any feedback and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Shane. We've just got 2 questions, open questions in the chat. And so I'd invite you to, those of us who are joining us remotely, to think of other questions that have come up as Shane has demonstrated the capabilities of the tool and some of the considerations behind how the tool was made. I'd also welcome those of us who are in the room, which comprises the transport project partners and the EBI members, I'd welcome kind of live questions from the group assembled here. But maybe we'll take a short break, no more than 5 minutes, to look at the questions that you've already posed and to give you a chance to type in any other questions you might have. Thanks.
I'm just going to take the first question, which is about US dollars. So again, the purpose of this tool is to try and impart some general lessons. We had considered converting to local currencies, but the issue is that costs change over time. Costs change quite quickly. One of our example countries is Ukraine, another is Argentina. And so by keeping the unit as US dollars, we were able to, again, simplify and talk about electromobility in rather broad strokes, rather than trying to account for hyper-local changes. With respect to the inclusion of fuel cell electric vehicles, they were excluded because, again, this project focuses on the GEF countries. So these are developing and emerging economies. It would be perhaps unrealistic to expect them to invest in hydrogen infrastructure in advance of promoting electromobility. It would seem that electromobility is a better choice for these countries. It's at a higher TRL. It has a lower cost to the user, frankly, I think FCEVs are not an ideal solution for developing and emerging economies, and so we did not include it.
There's a question about whether the tool could be expanded to include buses, and indeed we've considered the great value that might come for lots of these countries in extending the tool to consider not only buses but maybe two-wheelers or three-wheelers. This is something that's on the table. We could also leverage the data that's coming in from the in-country projects that I outlined. So, stay tuned. We haven't determined whether or not we'll be doing this, but we agree that it would be a very valuable contribution.
There was perhaps a second part to that question about fuel cells, and it's with respect to LNG. So again, Jeff specifically looks to promote electromobility. I included petrol and diesel because they're the incumbent technologies and they're very popular. There are some small select markets where CNG is also an incumbent fuel, but in many of those markets, the subsidies and the policies that promoted CNG are coming to an end. There's also an argument for the fact that it does not provide very substantial emissions reductions when compared to petrol and diesel. So we excluded CNG and LNG, and it's my belief that if we expanded the tool to heavy duty vehicles and to buses, we would not bring those options back in.
We've got two more questions here coming up, and I'm just giving Shane a chance to read them.
So this one here.
Okay, so we have a question. We have a question between offering demand incentives to purchase EVs and capital subsidies to public charging infrastructure. Which one is found to be more effective for EV adoption?
This is a question for which we don't have an easy answer, because we haven't performed a comparison yet. It's fair to say that in the early days of EVs, the focus was on vehicle adoption, and that's where the subsidies lay. It's also fair to say now that it might be prudent to switch towards incentivizing charging. As the cost of vehicles have fallen, they've become more attractive. People are perhaps more sensitive to price than ever before. And now the issue of availability of charging perhaps trumps the upfront cost of the vehicle. That, though, I believe is more of a question for developed economies than it is for developing and emerging economies. I think it's important to develop public infrastructure in these emerging economies, because otherwise it might be very difficult to incentivize people to switch. But it's an open question, and I think the answer would vary from region to region.
Great. Another very important question for us to clarify. Does the system provide default average values for the average level for each types of the vehicle in the country? That is, how are the defaults chosen when you pick a given country?
Yeah, so with the example countries, we have essentially a data file that chooses things like fuel costs, the tax regime, the vehicle costs. And so we have these assumptions built in that when you change the country, it will automatically update those default values. And they're based on extensive research. So we have the GFEI database, we have online research, and then we have searching through policy documents. So for example, tax policy. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Shane. And another question, as the TCO is a policy-focused tool, how have you incorporated or do you incorporate options for scenario definitions, fuel cost, mineral constraints, et cetera? Certainly fuel costs, I think Shane showed, those defaults also are coming from the direct in-country data about fuel prices and electricity prices, with a markup in the case of electricity, depending on the charging type. Mineral constraints is less a focus for this particular tool. Sorry to take away the answer to these two questions. If you've got questions as a in-person participant, I would invite you to just kind of grab my attention or put up your nameplate if you've got a nameplate.
I have a follow-up question on the default values. Sorry, I'm Sascha Scheffer from the Netherlands Ministry for Infrastructure and Water Management. I see, looking quickly at the tool, that for the fuel powertrains, you showed in your example diesel and petrol, but here it's more often like hybrid and petrol. Given that this is a project around electric vehicles, I was wondering why then the more fuel-based options are shown first instead of the electric options.
We assume that people will use the tool to make comparisons between different powertrains. The fact that diesel pops up first is, I mean, it's just a default. We kind of, we might revise that because I think it's a good suggestion to think that battery electric should be the default option, and we should maybe encourage people in that direction. So I'll take a note there, and maybe the default comparison should be between a battery electric and the incumbent technology. So we'll take your suggestion on board, and what I might do is, for example, in India, we'll take the most popular and we'll compare it to the battery electric option.
Thank you. I'm Francisco Laverón from Iberdrola. I mean, thank you for the presentation. I think it's a very good tool and we will play with it. I mean, the tool has been designed for a user perspective, but I think that it is also directed or designed for policymakers. So I don't know if it would be a good idea to include also externalities, especially in these countries, no? That, for example, pollution or loss of labor hours and health costs are so important. Thank you.
That's very true. And the production of the second tool is our life cycle assessment. So I think the metrics that you're talking about now are perhaps more appropriate to that life cycle assessment tool. And the TCO tool very much focused on costs. So we understand that policymakers focus very much on making the option attractive, and the main factor in attractiveness is cost. So right now, the TCO tool focuses just on that, like you said, from a user and a policymaker perspective, and these externalities will be dealt with in the LCA tool. We're actually in the phase now, we're taking in ideas for how that LCA tool should look. So I invite you to send a follow-up email with your ideas and suggestions, and we'll do our best to integrate them.
So a lot more questions are starting to come in, and thank you for those. I'll take this question. Does the tool consider different electricity tariff regimes, for instance, with and without demand charges?
What we have is 3 rates of electricity costs. So we have the day rate, the night rate, and the fast rate. And the issue here was to try and teach particularly policymakers, but also ordinary users that, by changing your charging behavior, you can have a cost benefit. It doesn't go very far beyond that, because again, what we run into is the issue of complexity versus accuracy. We can be incredibly accurate if we want, but we tend to lose focus on the lessons, and the actual change in the overall results is small. So thanks to the sensitivity analysis, we didn't go far beyond 3 charging tariffs, but we thought it was very important to leave them in there to try and encourage policymakers or make them aware of that option.
Another really good question here. Does the tool have the capacity or flexibilities to evaluate the TCO of used vehicles, especially used electric vehicles?
This was considered at the start. I think it is technically possible, because particularly with that custom option, we've allowed a lot of flexibility in terms of the input prices. And so a more advanced user will understand that this is technically possible. But the overall aim of the tool was to try and promote electromobility. And so there was a kind of a purposeful focus on new vehicles. So we're trying to encourage the adoption of new vehicles, but certainly for the more advanced users, that comparison is possible.
Don, if you could.
Yeah, validation with existing TCO models. I know you're in a space where they don't exist, but there are many. Have you validated with?
Short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is we were aiming at a different audience. So there are many TCO tools out there that are very accurate, but they're also perhaps very difficult to use. And you need a lot of technical expertise in order to get some valid results. And what we tried to avoid was a situation where it would be possible to make assumptions or to insert values that were unrealistic, and that would perhaps muddy the waters more so than, like we say, and then the phrase I've used a lot is impart these lessons. So our TCO tool is specifically aimed at people without a technical background, but it is accurate in comparison to these other tools.
I'd encourage you to continue typing in any questions that come to your mind. For those joining remotely, there's another question here around fuel cell electric vehicles for which there's a lot of attention, for instance, in some Latin American countries, the inclusion of fuel cell vehicles.
So as I kind of briefly explained, we had lots of stakeholder engagement, lots of webinars, and we debated the inclusion of different fuel options. At one stage, we were actually considering excluding PHEVs because we thought, trying to model user behavior and make sure that users understood that how they interacted with the vehicle and how they use the vehicle would have a large effect on TCO would be important. And under that philosophy, we found that fuel cell electric vehicles were perhaps, a technology that not that very many people will be considering, and the importance of how it will be used is maybe, something that's beyond the scope of this tool. So though there are a lot of stakeholders in Latin America considering fuel cell electric vehicles, these weren't necessarily our target audience.
There's a comment that it would be valuable to estimate the emissions coming from owning a battery electric vehicle, and that's exactly what we have in mind next. So we will be building over the coming year, maybe bleeding into early 2024, a life cycle analysis tool to look at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with building the vehicles, owning and operating them, and maintaining them, and then end of life. And so this is exactly the lines along which we are thinking. So thanks for that comment.
There's a quick, there's a quick question here about having to navigate the IEA website. The tool will be hosted on the IEA website for free, and so there won't be an option in the future where it is held elsewhere. So unfortunately, you'll have to come and visit us. I think what you're talking about there is perhaps more advanced than we would have considered. And I would point you towards the Working Group 4, who are producing a grid integration tool, which is perhaps more aligned with what you're suggesting, more policymaker focused, talks about the advantages of electrification in terms of essentially acting as storage for variable renewable electricity. And so I think there's a small bit of a kind of a purposeful divide of scope between ourselves and Working Group 4, where we're much more, we'll call it ordinary user focused or facing, and their tool is much more policymaker facing. So I think I would agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. You know, the more options we have to bring people on this journey and make them aware of the advantages and all the permutations that are there, the better. But it's perhaps a lot to try and achieve with one tool.
And I might just add to that, you know, there is this custom country where the user can define the inputs for fuel and electricity prices and for the overall vehicle cost and you know, you know, given some prerequisite knowledge on the part of the user about how these things are changing and understanding very much that they're quite dynamic in today's context, you know, there is some back-end calculation, especially for the critical minerals impacts on the battery prices that we could build in to try to make a bit more accessible and transparent in the tool. But on the fuel price inputs, this is something that's already quite built into the tool usability as it stands. And I think just to kind of continue along those lines, we have another question from Luguo. You know, does the system provide a sense check? For example, when people set some unreasonable value, will the system reject it? And this is indeed the question of setting not only the defaults, but the range for those kind of slider bars in a way that tries to steer people to real world and representative values, but also give flexibility to explore ranges at the same time. So, you know, if you're playing with the tool and you think that the ranges should be set larger, or, you know, you have other comments, we welcome feedback, because this is something that now that we've developed as a web interface, we can continue to improve. Another question, retrofit of ICE vehicles to EVs is gaining interest in many markets. Does the tool indicate the corresponding TCO?
Retrofitted vehicles are not currently included. And again, there's maybe an implicit assumption on our behalf that users who are considering such an option and considering it at the level of detail where they're looking to perform a TCO will still be able to use this tool to perform that analysis. But I believe that when we were building the tool to include a powertrain option such as retrofit would perhaps, again, you know, be more complex or probably confuse more users than it brings along with us, you know. So there was a little note I said there, always error on the side of simplicity. And so although we believe that including retrofit as a vehicle or a powertrain option would probably be suitable for some people, it arguably confuses more than it brings with us.
Two more questions that are very welcome and related. What would be the procedure to include new countries in the TCO tool? And how could a country be placed as a default country in the tool? Is there a way to support on the needed information?
I absolutely welcome anyone that wants to provide data, and we have built the tool in such a way that adding countries is not particularly difficult. The difficult part in adding countries is having reliable information, reliable data, particularly with respect to vehicle costs. And I might go on a small tangent here, where when we're looking through sales figures, for example, one of the difficult things to do is to try and surmise the trim level, because very often the trim level and some of these extras has a greater effect on the total cost of the vehicle than what we would consider, say, technology choices. So if someone is able to point towards a source of information and that source would allow us to add another country with relative confidence, that's something we're absolutely willing to do.
And indeed, you know, just to reiterate, the custom country is designed to allow users who have a good grasp of the fuel input prices and the costs and the financing, the loan terms for specific vehicles to put those in and see what comes out. Eamon?
Eamon Mulholland from the International Council on Clean Transportation. So 2 questions. The first is on the default fuel consumption values that you apply for the countries. To what extent do they cover real world versus type approval? Second question on carbon taxes. I see that in the advanced version, you have a slider which adds in CO2 or other taxes as a percentage of, I guess, of the purchase price. But I guess CO2 taxes are going to be more related to the fuel consumption, to the actual fuel. Did you give any consideration towards allowing the user to input in a USD per ton of CO2 into the model?
So the way that the taxes are calculated there is an attempt to try and cover all of these different countries. So for example, the way the taxes are calculated in South Africa is significantly different than it is in Ukraine. And by putting in CO2 and other taxes, it was, like I said, an attempt to kind of make a one-size-fits-all tool. It is, I would agree that a ton per CO2 or grams of CO2 per kilometer would be, more reflective of how these taxes are generally calculated. But it would perhaps, again, with the whole philosophy of erring on the side of simplicity, we went for something that was a percentage, In future versions of the tool, we might consider this. And in terms of the fuel economy, we went for WLTP figures for both, say, electrified and liquid fuel powertrains. So the figure we use is liters per 100 kilometers, because we believe that's one it's easy to comprehend. And it's one that if you go to Google, you can generally find that information for your vehicle. So in the spirit of using the custom calculator to kind of look at those awkward interactions, you can go to Google and get your answer.
Excellent. Matteo?
Hello, Matteo from the International Transport Forum. Thank you very much for this tool. Will any model documentation or perhaps the underlying Excel be made available, as it may be useful to sort of help increase the transparency for certain users as well? Thank you.
Yeah, that's something we've considered. So originally, I tried my best to avoid the need for documentation, to make it all available on the web page and to make it as simple as possible. Number one, it's my experience and from the stakeholder engagement, let's say the share of users that would be interested in that level of detail would be small. I think we might appreciate that in a room full of engineers and IEA people, that we would look for that, but most people don't. So if you go through the web page, the majority of what would traditionally be included in a documentation is there in kind of small little notes around the page. But certainly if there's ideas of other things that should be included or other notes, we'll add them. And if it gets to the point where the page is essentially a little cluttered, we will happily add a documentation.
Great. Maybe one last question and then we'll wrap up. We have a question about the criteria. So clarifying again what the criteria were for selecting the specific countries, and making the note that there might be other countries among the 50 countries where there are projects underway for the GEF project, GEF7 project, where the TCO, where EVs might perform even better in a TCO comparison. Yeah, just to clarify the criteria for selecting the specific countries. And this person is also pointing out that there might, some of the countries that we didn't select might, EVs might compare better.
So we wanted to get a kind of broad spread of countries. So as you see there, we kind of have one from Africa, one from Europe, one from Asia. And the selection criteria was kind of simple. It was, is there accurate and dependable information available for these countries? And as a subset of the GEF countries, I think 5 is, probably accurate. Hopefully, over time, the number of countries for which we have reliable information increases, and we can add those countries. But the selection criteria, very simply, again, was, is accurate information available? Can we get a good spread geographically?
So a few more questions are coming in, but we do also have to wrap up. So I'd invite you to play with the tool. We have pasted the URL in the chat. Maybe we'll paste it one last time so that it's here at the bottom of the chat for you to look at. And, Shane shared the email address of the working group 1 IEA, who's, where we can help receive feedback for the tool. And I think there's also a link on the tool itself that allows you to give feedback. And that's very valuable because unless we get some feedback from users of the tool, we can't improve it. Thanks a lot for joining us. And we hope that you find this tool useful, informative, interesting, and please go ahead and play with it. And we welcome your ideas about how we could make it better.